Hi, good evening. As you've already heard, integration has become far more important in recent years, but the whole idea of integration has changed fundamentally over the last 15 or 20 years. And I think I'm just going to try and identify a few trends because we haven't got a long time this evening. Firstly, just to think about integration before the year 2000. Really, it was less of a priority for government, less of a priority for local government. It was seen really that somehow minority communities would gradually integrate into majority communities over a period of time. It was perhaps seen as desirable that there was a certain amount of keeping communities apart in any event. It avoided assimilation, and that's been a big tenet of multicultural policy in Britain. Roy Jenkins made a famous speech in the 60s about avoiding assimilation, not having a sort of flat level society in which everyone was the same. So actually this degree of separation and segregation aided that. And maybe white communities also felt as though, well, we're not quite sure about minorities and maybe integration is a bit of a problem for us too. And I think there was some denial about the extent of segregation at that point. Also, when we talked about integration prior to 2000, 2001, it was really in residential terms. That's almost the only way we understood segregation, thinking about the way housing and estates were integrated or not. And actually, that was great work for geographers because it was geographers that really, I think, created a number of indices that looked at the way where people lived in relation to each other, the isolation index and so on. And really, that's the measure that we had of segregation. However, it changed really after 2001. We had the riots in northern towns in England. And suddenly the focus shifted away from pure residential segregation. And it was no longer just simply about the conflict of minority communities with the state. And we'd seen previous riots, the black community in particular in the 80s, focused on conflict with the state, the extent of disadvantage, the Scarman report in particular, commenting on the degree of segregation underscored by disadvantage and dissatisfaction. The conflicts in 2001 were actually between communities, between white and Asian communities, and I'm using the word Asian very deliberately, which I'll come to in a minute. And my report, the team that looked into the disturbances at that time, came up with this concept of parallel lives, that people actually from different backgrounds had very little, if any, contact with each other. And that lack of contact really gave birth to the whole idea again of contact theory, which had been around for a long time, but we hadn't actually used very much, where people lived in completely isolated worlds, had no contact with each other, no understanding of each other, no empathy with each other, and consequently lived in fear and apprehension about the other community, particularly when they were put into competition with each other, which was a part of government policy at that time, and particularly when it was stirred up by mischievous elements, usually on the far right, to try and create hatred between community. If you hadn't had any contact with somebody who was different from yourself, how could you begin to disconfirm the stereotypes and to diminish the prejudice if you just simply lived in your own world? There was no attempt to promote any sense of a shared society, and really it was community cohesion which said this is something we actually have to tackle. We have to bring communities together, the whole concept of bridging cultures, bridging capital, and saying actually this isn't about losing your heritage or your history, it's about having another layer of identity on top of that which recognized that. But it was more than that. It was saying segregation was not really just simply about residential segregation. It was also about the way in which communities were divided in their schools by faith, by sporting activities, by a whole range of different elements. And this is where the concept of parallel lives came from, that it wasn't just at one level of integration or segregation, it was across a range of different areas. And we began to measure then integration in a rather different way, not just about residential proximity, but actually whether people felt that they had some affinity with other groups. And lots of surveys were undertaken on an annual basis to say, did you feel that you belong to this area? Do you feel that you get on well with people from different backgrounds? What are your perceptions of safety in the community? What is the extent of inequalities and so on? So really it changed a great deal in the way in which it was conceived and the way in which it was measured. From about 2005, the agenda began to shift again. And it began to shift because of the government's preoccupation with the prevent agenda and the focus on Muslim communities, the focus on counter-terrorism in particular, and the idea that somehow potential terrorists were being groomed in these closed communities, which undoubtedly led to a whole series of new measures about integration. And it created a climate of suspicion around the Muslim communities, which carries on today. I mean, it's only last year that we had the Counter-Terrorism Act, which actually exacerbated the extent of surveillance of Muslim communities, Muslim children in schools and so on, as part of a national program. And that meant that the government shifted its focus to integration in terms of British values. Do communities share this sense of British values? And it went on to define them in very general terms: freedom of the press and democracy, the rule of law and so on, which actually probably aren't British values, they're universal values, but that's another debate. But the point is that the extent of integration shifted to a very value-laden agenda away from some of the previous factors. Actually, the government activity in those areas, government measures, we no longer, all the prospects of asking people about whether they felt integrated, their own perceptions were all dropped, and it was switched over to how many schools were teaching British values. To some extent, this was supplemented by non-governmental organisations looking at hate crime. And finally, last year, in July last year, the Prime Minister decided that we must again look at cohesion. And as you've already heard, has commissioned Louise Casey to do a report on integration, due to a report any time now, and develop another cohesion programme. Well, we'll wait and see what comes of that, I guess. So what is the state of integration? Well, even to think about it, 15 years on after my report, is an extremely different concept. Because 15 years ago, we were talking about a number of minority communities juxtaposed with the majority community. We talked about the Asian community or the Indian community, the Pakistani community, the Black Caribbean community, and so on. Now, every major city in the world is super diverse. London, 350 languages. Even small towns like Boston in Lincolnshire has 65 languages and 14 separate faiths. The extent and nature of diversity has changed out of all recognition in those 15 years or so. And of course, we've seen the consequences of that. Mixed race and mixed faith is the fastest growing ethnic minority, not only in the UK, but across Europe. And we've seen the growth of the far right in response to some of these changes. And we also have a new idea about integration. What impact does transnational communications and social media have on who we relate to? Is it just who we're sat next door to? Is it just which school we go to and who shares that school? Or how do we actually see ourselves in the virtual world and in this sense of international communications? So we have to think about integration, I think, in rather different ways. I want to distinguish two trends. And this is a bit of a simplified analysis, but I think there are two things that are going on in the UK at the moment. First, we are actually seeing the growth of more mixed areas, residentially, in schools, more diversity, and not just in relation to race and ethnicity and faith, but also sexual orientation, disability, health conditions of all shapes and sizes. We are seeing a different nature of diversity. And actually what we're finding is, particularly that younger people that have grown up with that diversity, gone to school and seen it as part of their daily program, regard that as the new normal. Diversity is normal. It's not a threat. It's not something which we need to be afraid of. But we're also seeing, at the same time, a growth of far more segregated areas. In London, in Luton, in Peterborough, in most northern towns, where areas which were either minority and in some cases majority of a particular level have become more intensely concentrated. So we're actually seeing a growth of more segregation in relation to certain areas. There's a number of disputed trends in all of this. I mentioned earlier that younger people seem to be growing up with diversity and therefore it's not a threat to them. A recent study has suggested it's a bit more complicated than that, about whether you are moving into an area or moving out of an area. I can go into that later on if necessary. But there is this feeling somehow that more diversity and particularly more change in an area can actually get whichever community it is to hunker down more, to become more inward looking as a consequence of the change which they may see as a threat. There's also this notion of white flight. Now, there is no doubt that white British people in particular are moving out of towns and cities at a huge extent. I mean, in London between 2001 and 2011, 600,000 white British people moved out of London. At the same time, London grew by 12% to 8.2 million. And so the inward movement was very much in relation to minorities. But is that white flight? In other words, did they move because they're white and they were racially motivated? Or did they move because actually that was part of economic development? They were moving in a familial pattern perhaps, and therefore was unrelated to any racial motive. But the key issue there is that they did move, and therefore the areas, and particularly cities in the country, have become more concentrated. This is summed up by the Demos Integration Hub that identified a number of segregation trends. And really it just emphasizes the point I've already made, that areas that were more minority have become increasingly focused around a minority. Areas that were mainly majority white, have become more mixed in general terms. And the interesting point, really, I guess, from this is that the very first one, though white areas are less white in 2011 than in 2001, minority areas are not less minority. So we're seeing that concentration. So there's also an area basis to this as well. As I've mentioned, the northern part of England seems to be higher in terms of segregation, Midlands in the middle, south lower, some variation to that. Schools tend to follow residential patterns, so schools generally have become more segregated in areas of minority concentration and slightly less segregated in areas of majority concentration. And there's also questions of looking at this on a number of different spheres. In employment, for example, there's a huge level of segregation in the food processing, picking, packaging industry. A huge number of people in very segregated work environments. Far less so in parts of London and in professional services. And there is also evidence of other forms of segregation, even some universities and university courses, for example, you could describe as segregated. The highest level of segregation anywhere in the UK is, of course, Northern Ireland. Residential segregation, particularly in Belfast, reinforced by 95 peace walls. Well, peace walls are huge 40-foot high fences or walls, dividing communities, sometimes running down the middle of school playgrounds to make sure that communities kept apart. 97% of all schools are entirely segregated. Sports centres, swimming baths, segregated. Shops even segregated. Estate agents, solicitors tend to be segregated as well. So, you know, there's another dimension to segregation which you might wish to pick up on later. I just wanted to finish by saying, in my view, we've got to sort of change the way we think about this and think about it in a much more intercultural sense. And our concepts of difference and integration just really have to change. Integration, really, who are we trying to integrate with? Who is it that's different? Who's different from me? Is it somebody that happens to share the same skin color, the same social class, the same educational background? How do we actually define difference? And is that difference real or imagined? And that concept of difference is changing all the time. Certainly the difference which I grew up with in London a long time ago is totally different to the difference which is now accepted and acceptable in current spheres. So our notion of difference changes over time and place. We have to see difference as dynamic. We have to see diversity and identity as dynamic. And we have to see it as multifaceted, as this young lady says. I'm a Glaswegian Pakistani teenager of Muslim descent who supports Glasgow Rangers in a Catholic school. If you know anything about the last 2 points, you know how difficult that is. The point is that she will change her identity, not only over time, but actually in relation to who she's talking to and what community she's part of at that particular time. And we have to recognize that this is much more multifaceted. And whereas 15 years ago we used to think of difference really generated inside Britain and inside our own borders, we used to think we had these sort of somehow borders which we control, which was never the case anyway. But the point is that now difference is driven as much internationally as it is nationally. The impact of diasporas, the impact of European, international financial markets and so on has changed our notion of difference. And we have a new politics of national identity. And when you ask young people today, and recent opinion polls by Ipsos, Mori and others bear this out, actually the first thing when you ask them about their identity is often not their race, ethnicity, their faith, or even their nationality. It's their social network, it's the brand which they buy, it's their leisure pursuit. The way they think of themselves is totally different to the way that we ascribe to them. And that is part of the problem, this ascription of identity. And somehow, and Amartya Sen, I think summed this up, that conflict and violence, the difference that we have, the tensions that we have in the community are sustained today by this illusion of a unique identity. And that is, I think, where we need to change most of all. The new we is more diverse. It includes us, it includes them. Thank you very much.